This is Dr. Manfra. The title of this brief presentation is Taking Stock: Approaches to Disciplined Inquiry. It's intended to help summarize and reflect on our previous week's readings. Across our readings, we have encountered a continuum of inquiry in the social studies classroom, from those that are proponents of tightly scaffolded, structured inquiry and those that are proponents of more open-ended inquiry. We've encountered a means-end discussion in terms of thinking through the purposes of integrating inquiry into the classroom to engage students in more ambitious teaching and learning, rigor and depth, and also authentic intellectual work. These, of course, are offered of examples of the myriad ways that inquiry has been integrated into the social studies and has been theorized into the social studies. As Say's chapter points out, the social studies has a long history of inquiry. He highlights, for instance, the new social studies projects of the 1960s and 70s. The progressives in the earlier period and some critics of the new social studies conceptualized the purpose of social studies as social education for citizenship with rigorous and often interdisciplinary inquiry, serving as a means for civic decision-making. Operating from a view of social sciences, most creators of the new social studies projects and some disciplinary scholars from the progressive period conceptualized disciplinary inquiry as a valued end of itself, with the assumption that developing disciplinary understandings would implicitly cultivate informed citizens. Over time, 30 years of research in learning and cognition have fundamentally altered conceptions about the development of understanding and expertise and have shaped current conceptions of what is required for effective disciplinary inquiry. Say and others point to quote-unquote expert novice studies in which we study learning trajectories with the purposes of helping students develop the requisite skills and understandings in order to develop more expertise in a particular field. Usually this expertise refers to disciplinary ways of knowing and disciplinary concept knowledge. In terms of thinking about research in learning and cognition, Say summarizes the National Research Council, which provides us with a three-part understanding about student cognition. First is that learners' preconceptions about the world must be addressed to grasp new concepts. This is the notion of prior knowledge, that students aren't blank slates and that teachers must not only diagnose, but also to reteach what students know. The second point is that competence in an area of inquiry demands deep content knowledge, organized in conceptual frameworks that allow application and transfer to new situations. One of the common misconceptions is that factual knowledge must be a prerequisite for inquiry-based approaches to teaching. But this research demonstrates the opposite is true, that in order for deep content knowledge to occur, students must have opportunities for authentic intellectual work and disciplinary inquiry. And then finally, teachers need to equip students with strategic and metacognitive strategies to evaluate and guide their own learning. Students must be supported through scaffolds and other approaches to begin asking questions about their understanding, to know what they know and why they know it. There's much been said about designing supportive inquiry learning environments as well. Probably the most obvious is that it must be engaging to learners. We talk a lot about motivation and making inquiry-based approaches more relevant to students. We also need to attend to the role of social mediation, and then finally, scaffolding expertise. As Say suggests, these could be hard scaffolds. We read a variety of those, like the SCIMC model, which takes students through a series of questions, or softer scaffold, like student or teacher prompting. So for you all, the big questions remain, well, what do we mean by ambitious teaching? How do we achieve both rigor and depth in the social studies classroom? And what ultimately happens when our students engage in authentic intellectual work? Look more closely at authentic intellectual work, for example, it's a three-part framework, and with the notion that none of these three parts can be separated from the whole in order to achieve authentic intellectual work. Students must have opportunities to develop deep content knowledge through disciplined inquiry that's relevant to the world beyond school. So within this continuum of inquiry, I would argue that there's somewhere in the middle, something called guided inquiry and disciplined inquiry. These are approaches that are neither totally structured or open-ended, but do provide students with proper scaffolding so that they can begin to understand the disciplines. Examples of guided inquiry that we read include Miller's article on using project-based learning, Say's chapter on discipline inquiry, Parker and Hess's article on teaching for discussion, and Hicks and his colleagues' article on the SCIMC strategy for engaging students with historical inquiry and multimedia. Each of these provides different types of approaches to integrating guided inquiry into the classroom. Again, across each of these, the teacher's role is very important as a curriculum gatekeeper to support student success. Other examples we've encountered include problem-based learning or project-based learning, structured academic controversies, and then we're beginning to look more closely at the C3 framework. I'd argue that all three of these are, again, situated within this continuum of inquiry, somewhere between structured and open-ended inquiry, with perhaps a structured academic controversy being more structured than some forms of problem-based learning. With the C3 framework, we have a template that you can follow to develop both compelling and supporting questions to guide students' inquiry across a variety of deep issues in the social studies content. So according to Say, it's important for us to think about what we mean by disciplined inquiry. This takes us back to the ends means debate. According to him, the first position, drawing from social science and looking to expertise as practiced by those in the academic disciplines, might be characterized as disciplinary inquiry. So in other words, we want our students to understand content associated with the academic disciplines. The second position, based more in the social education tradition, might be called disciplined civic inquiry, rather than establishing a learning target by asking what do expert academics do. Proponents of this position might ask what do expert citizens do. As you're reading the C3 framework, I'd like you to try to be attuned to the manner in which the framework situates itself relative to these two positions of disciplined inquiry and disciplined civic inquiry. As we move on throughout the semester, we're going to be moving towards more of a focus on your own work and development as a teacher, and you're going to be integrating inquiry into your practice. In many ways, this is a self-study of your teaching and the way in which you plan, integrate, carry out, and then study student learning outcomes in your classroom. So again, the final weeks of the semester, if you look at the Moodle page, you'll see as after we move on from reading about the C3 framework and evaluating C3 modules, you'll begin to integrate inquiry into your classroom. There's a series of teaching reflections and discussion posts, as well as critical friends feedback meetings that will lead you to the final assignment for the course. In your final assignment, you'll provide a step-by-step description of the inquiry-based teaching and learning activity that you integrated into your instruction. You have choice here. You could create your own C3 module, you could integrate structured academic controversy, problem-based learning, or some other form of inquiry into your classroom. As long as you think about it sitting somewhere along that continuum of inquiry instruction. You'll also be assessing student learning. This gets back to that ends means debate. After all, the major purpose of all of this work is to help our students learn more and to learn more deeply. So over the course of your integration of the inquiry project, you'll be asked to assess student learning and to respond in written reflection about what your students learned, how did you assess their learning, and if possible, to provide examples of student learning. You'll also be asked to reflect on your impressions of the lesson. What were strengths? What would you change in the future? You'll be asked to attach a copy of your lesson, and depending on the format you'll use, you should align your lesson plan with a template that is from the field, for example, using the C3 framework template or a structured academic controversy template. And then finally, you'll attach a short video segment demonstrating your teaching and or student work. The little note at the bottom is that these are just for internal purposes. They won't be shared beyond the class. All right, so we have a good sense of where we're going. In many ways, this project will engage you in inquiry about your use of inquiry and the way in which you engage your students. And so I encourage you to take on an inquiry stance in your teaching, in which you become a student of your student and learn about how they respond to the various approaches to inquiry that you try to integrate into your classroom. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I wish you well in your work.